What if what you call madness is actually your soul trying to break free? What if that chaos in your mind isn't illness but the beginning of your awakening? Jung discovered this when his world collapsed and everyone thought he was losing his mind. It's not madness, it's your soul screaming for transformation. But society tells you to silence it. What if the voices, the visions, the breakdowns are actually breakthroughs? Not all suffering is sickness, some is sacred. Are you ready to stop running from what's trying to emerge and finally listen to what your soul has been desperately trying to tell you? There are moments when the body is functioning, the routine keeps running on autopilot, but something inside seems broken. It's not physical pain, not exactly sadness, but a kind of muffled emptiness, a heavy silence that seems to scream inside your chest. When Jung wrote the Red Book, he wasn't just writing, he was bleeding soul onto paper. What many would call psychological suffering, he recognized as the beginning of an existential collapse. A collapse that, ironically, doesn't destroy, it reveals. It's not depression, it's the beginning of a spiritual awakening, although disguised as chaos. Most people try to silence this scream with distractions, work, screens, quick promises of happiness. But the more you run, the further the soul drifts away. What few understand is that suffering doesn't come to punish, it comes to summon. It invites the person to dive into the deep unconscious, where answers aren't logical, but symbolic. Just like Jung, who interrupted his public life at the height of his career to listen to himself, maybe this nameless discomfort is the soul's first calling, a whisper that only becomes a scream when we insist on ignoring it. It's like being in the middle of a party, surrounded by people and feeling invisible, or waking up one day and realizing that everything has lost its shine, as if life had become a cardboard backdrop. This kind of feeling isn't on the radar of medical exams, but it's registered in the language of the soul. And here's the point. Maybe what you feel isn't illness, but a signal, a deep plea for inner transformation. A calling that might very well be the same one that led Jung to the beginning of his journey. And when the calling intensifies, it's because something inside you is about to crumble. There's an invisible thread that holds life together, meaning. When it snaps, the world collapses, even though everything might still seem in order on the outside. The rupture of meaning doesn't come with warning signs. It arrives subtly, like losing interest in things that once brought joy. For Jung, this breakdown was the trigger for what he later understood as a process of spiritual rebirth. It wasn't just a crisis, it was the collapse of a self that could no longer bear to carry the soul's truth. When the old breaks, the new isn't clear yet. But the void between one and the other is already unbearable. This space between what's gone and what hasn't been born yet is what many hastily call depression. But could it be something deeper than that? Jung didn't rush to cure the discomfort, he listened to it. Because in that existential collapse, there was a code, an invitation to abandon structures that no longer served and allow another part of him to emerge. This kind of pain isn't solved with ready-made advice. It needs to be crossed with presence, with humility, with the courage to come undone, because only those who come undone can remake themselves. Think of a sandcastle being carried away by the sea. At first, it looks like destruction. But what if what's coming undone is precisely what was preventing the soul from flourishing? Many people reach this point thinking they've lost their way, when in truth, it's the old map that stopped making sense. Reading authors like Viktor Frankl or Clarice Lispector can help at this point. They translate the void with words that embrace. But still, it's just the beginning, because right after the breaking comes something even more frightening, the fall. And that's when many people think they're being destroyed, when, in reality, they're being redirected. When everything inside begins to crumble, the natural impulse is to resist. But Jung did the opposite. He surrendered to the fall. He didn't try to control, didn't try to understand. He dove in. Because at certain moments, the logical mind can no longer cope. What remains is to trust in what can't yet be explained. The deep unconscious isn't a dark hole where reason is lost. It's a symbolic realm where the forgotten truth dwells. And sometimes you have to fall to get there. The soul doesn't reveal itself under spotlights. It whispers in the dark. Of course, this fall is scary. The person feels outside their own body, disconnected from the world, as if living in slow motion. But what if this state isn't a mistake, but a process? By diving into himself, Jung began to encounter images, dreams, voices, things that seemed like madness but carried meaning. What was once seen as psychological suffering gradually revealed itself as a passage. It's like going down to the basement of your own house. The air is thick, but that's where the forgotten parts of identity are stored. And maybe between fear and silence, something new is about to emerge. Think of a diver who descends to the ocean floor. He doesn't take baggage, only what's necessary to breathe. The same goes for this inner dive. You can't take certainties, others' opinions, labels. You have to be naked of yourself. Some people find this through writing letters never sent, others through recorded dreams, or even listening to music that touches where words can't reach. But what matters isn't the method, it's the surrender. Because after the fall comes the encounter, and what Jung found wasn't exactly what he expected. While most would try to silence the delusions with diagnoses, Jung did something unusual. He drew, he painted, wrote, daydreamed, because he understood that the deep unconscious doesn't speak in sentences. It speaks in symbols. At the height of his existential collapse, images began to sprout like visions, characters, living archetypes. He welcomed them one by one, even without understanding them. And there, on paper stained with ink and anguish, something unexpected began to happen, a type of healing that doesn't come from logic but from listening to the soul. A visual, intuitive, almost magical listening. These images weren't random. They were condensed messages, coming from the shadow, from the self, from everything he had ignored for too long. Each figure was an invitation, a reminder that suffering wasn't useless, but transformative. Jung discovered that there was intelligence in pain, a soul alchemy hidden behind the chaos. Many people today make this same movement by creating art, writing diaries, photographing themselves in silence. It's not about aesthetics. It's about finding form for what hasn't yet become words, but screams wanting to exist. I remember a patient who, in the midst of a meaning crisis, began sculpting clay figures without knowing why. Only later did she realize she was molding her own pain. That's what we're talking about. You don't need to know how to draw, paint, or write well. You just need to start. A notebook, a box of pencils, a notepad on your phone. It might seem silly at first glance, but these symbols are maps. And when we start tracing them, they inevitably lead us to the next great encounter, the one with the shadow that dwells within us. The shadow doesn't appear like a movie villain. It emerges as that anger without reason, jealousy disguised as morality, fear dressed up as control. Jung understood this when, in his dive, he began to encounter disturbing inner figures. They weren't external demons, but parts of himself he had denied his whole life. The shadow is made of everything we don't want to be, but are. And psychological suffering deepens precisely at this point, not to destroy us, but to show us what needs to be seen with courage and without judgment. Many people run from the shadow thinking it's a sign of weakness or even madness. But Jung did the opposite. He sat with it, listened, wrote about it. Because inner transformation doesn't happen when we deny pain, but when we listen to it with brutal honesty. The shadow brings anger, shame, resentment, yes, but it also carries power, creativity, intuition. Ignoring it is like locking a room in the house with treasures inside just because it's messy. And look here, the more it's ignored, the more it screams. And often it screams through the body, dreams, relationships that fall apart for no apparent reason. Once I heard a story of a man who always criticized others for being weak. Until he was diagnosed with panic disorder. He wasn't weak, he was being forced to meet his own shadow. From there, he began writing letters to the child he once was. Other people find this contact through therapies like psychodrama, therapeutic writing, or even films like Black Swan or Fight Club, which throw open the mirror of the shadow. But that's just the beginning. Because after this part of us is seen, something much deeper begins to crumble, the ego itself. At the height of his dive, Jung describes a symbolic experience of death. Not a physical death, but the implosion of the ego. That part of us that says, I am like this, I need this, I control everything. When suffering reaches an unbearable point, it's as if the soul pushes the ego to the corner, saying, now it's my turn. And then begins the true spiritual rebirth. You can't be reborn carrying the same certainties that brought us to collapse. Extreme pain has this role, to empty what's false, to make room for what's real. Jung's Red Book narrates this process as a mystical journey, almost alchemical. The old self dies little by little, in disappointments, losses, inevitable breakups. The identity that seemed solid begins to crack. And at this point, many think they're going crazy, when, in truth, they're shedding the illusions that kept an exhausted persona standing. What emerges after this fall isn't a new version of the old self. It's something deeper, a more rooted, silent psychic center that no longer needs external validation. A voice that comes from within and no longer accepts being silenced. Once I talked to a woman who said she was losing her mind after grieving her mother. But in the middle of the pain, she began to feel something she had never felt. A desire to live more authentically, to write, to travel alone, to cry without apologizing. Her ego was dying, and her soul was finally beginning to breathe. Films like Eat, Pray, Love, or The Seventh Seal portray this collapse with symbolic force. But living it firsthand is another story. And when this new soul awakens, it no longer fits into dogmas, ready-made formulas, or rigid religions. It seeks something more. When inner collapse leads to awakening, the spirituality that emerges isn't what you learn in books or temples. It's a deep, personal, and symbolic experience. Jung showed that this type of awakening is born from direct experience, from internal dialogue with one's own images, pains, and fears. It's not religion with rigid dogmas or memorized formulas, but a living connection with the soul, a reunion with soul alchemy. It's feeling that the sacred is in the everyday, in small things, in crises and silences that no one else perceives. Many people think spirituality has to do with belief, but here, the key word is experience. There's no point in memorizing sacred passages if there isn't a real process of inner transformation. It's a path where the person learns to trust their own feelings, to accept mystery without needing to name everything. This freedom can be scary because it breaks the comfort of dogmas, but it opens space for an authentic rebirth, one that doesn't need an audience or external approval. Spirituality like this is a journey of courage. A practical example is noticing how small daily rituals, a coffee drunk in silence, a walk in nature, attentive listening to a dream, can become portals to this encounter. Authors like James Hillman and Thomas Moore deepen this idea of poetic spirituality, where the sacred inhabits the ordinary. Awakening in this sense isn't a mystical leap, but a slow, patient realignment that challenges the hurry of modern life. And if the soul is really screaming, maybe it's time to learn to listen to silence. Many people see cure as a final destination, a finish line where everything gets resolved. Jung, however, showed that what happens in the Red Book journey isn't cure in the conventional sense. It's a deep transformation, a dance between pain and meaning. Suffering doesn't magically disappear. It's invited to become part of the story, a fundamental piece of soul alchemy. This is the true revolution, learning to live with pain and finding a new purpose in it. This transformation isn't comfortable or quick. It's a crossing that requires presence and courage to face what the rational mind prefers to avoid. Psychological suffering becomes raw material, not an obstacle. It's as if the soul were cooking something on low heat, a silent process that stirs the depths until the old dissolves and something new emerges. In this sense, the idea of cure is limited, because it assumes something is wrong and needs to be fixed. Transformation, on the other hand, embraces imperfection and chaos. For those living through this crisis, it might be helpful to seek practices that help navigate this change without drowning in it. Expressive therapies like art therapy, contact with nature, mindfulness, or even deep reading of text like Jung's Red Book are tools that open space for this inner alchemy. The key is not to flee from pain, but to allow it to transform. And this is a message that resonates with the spiritual rebirth that many are beginning to experience, even without knowing it. When the soul finds itself in the middle of chaos, the natural impulse might be despair or escape. However, Jung showed that from this chaos, something surprising can be born: creation. Jung's Red Book is, in itself, a testimony to this transformation, a work of art that sprouted from suffering and inner confusion. Creating, whether painting, writing, or dreaming, isn't just a way to escape, but a way to reorganize the inner world and give meaning to what seemed formless. This creative process is the true soul alchemy. In the midst of existential collapse, the act of creating works like a lighthouse in the fog, illuminating paths that the conscious mind can't reach. Jung used drawing as a bridge to the deep unconscious, allowing symbols to emerge and speak. Today, many people find in journaling, music, or other forms of expression a refuge and a mirror for their own shadows. It's like transforming the storm into dance. Think of that friend who, after a difficult period, began painting abstract pictures that no one understood, but that emanated an inexplicable force. Or the person who, lost in crises, decided to write a book that helped them understand their own inner labyrinth. Creation doesn't need to be grand to be powerful. The simple act of giving form to chaos is already a step towards spiritual rebirth, which makes pain not an end point, but the beginning of a new and surprising journey. The soul's awakening doesn't usually arrive with trumpets or overwhelming euphoria. Quite the opposite. It emerges in silence, like a deep realignment that happens far from the world's eyes. Jung realized that true inner revolution is discreet, almost invisible to those watching from the outside. This movement isn't madness, as many think, but an ancient wisdom that begins to take its place. A calling that echoes deep in the chest, asking passage for a new way of being. It's common to confuse this awakening with an endless crisis, suffering without end. However, the soul that screams in silence is actually creating space for something that goes beyond immediate understanding. It's what Jung called spiritual rebirth, a transformation that isn't spectacular, but radical in its depth. Often this change happens gradually in small gestures, choices, and thoughts that seem insignificant, but carry immense weight for those who live them. Anyone who has been through this knows there's no going back to the old pattern. The soul awakens to a broader reality, where the psychological shadow and light coexist, where psychological suffering is recognized, but no longer defines. It's as if silence became voice, pain became learning, and chaos, harmony. And then the question hangs in the air: are you really listening to what your soul is trying to tell you? The time has come to look at all this with courage and ask yourself, what are you willing to face within yourself to allow this inner transformation? Is it possible to embrace your own shadow without fear, without running from the discomfort it brings? The spiritual awakening that Jung reveals in the Red Book isn't an easy path, but it's an invitation to be reborn, even when everything seems to be falling apart. Now, think, which part of your soul is screaming silently to be heard. The invitation is for you to start seeing your psychological suffering not as an obstacle, but as the raw material for your soul alchemy. Inner transformation only happens when you decide to leave passivity behind and dive deep into the deep unconscious, even if this provokes an existential collapse. So, are you ready to begin this spiritual rebirth and rediscover meaning in crisis? If this content resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos about transformation and self-knowledge. Leave your experiences, questions, or reflections here in the comments. I want to know what you think about this silent awakening of the soul. And before you go, take a look at the video that's appearing on your screen now. It will help you delve even deeper into this journey of inner rebirth.